Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and we're going mudletting with Miss Havisham. Okay, so this morning I had the great pleasure of having a nice long chat with Miss Havisham for the first time. And by her suggestion, we recorded it. And so this plays out more like a podcast. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning, so we couldn't get a video call going. And there are a couple of slight audio issues, but overall, I think it went really well. And so I'm happy to share it with everybody. And, you know, I've made no secret along the way of my admiration for Miss Havisham and the work that she's doing. You know, she has definitely been an inspiration to me along the way, and I've picked up a lot of very useful information watching her channel. And if you haven't, you should be subscribed by now. Okay? And so as I was saying, we did have some technical difficulties, but while we were trying to suss those out, we started talking about Joseph Gregory Hallett, you know, the possibility of him being good King John III. And so I'm just gonna kind of pick it up with that. And so here we go. Mudletting with Miss Havisham.
So he has been a prolific author. He lives in Australia.
I was gonna say, when I watched his like little, you know, GoFundMe commercial, you know, and I was like, this guy's Australian.
Yeah, he's in Australia. But of course, Australia is under one of the dominion of Great Britain.
Oh yeah, it still is today, I'm sure. I mean, I don't know. Is it still considered a Commonwealth of England today?
Oh yeah, definitely. But I don't think they really are that bothered. The general populace, I don't think they're that bothered of staying that way. But that's how it came about when Captain Cook went down there in the 1700s, and that's when the British Crown laid claim to it all. But there's lots of mystery about Captain Cook. I mean, as I discovered on one of the gravestones I looked at recently, the cook is 33. You know, so I mean, well, Captain Cook, it was a real person. I mean, obviously, he set sail from somewhere not far from here, at Whitby. Whitby in North Yorkshire was where he was born there, or just a village just outside. And, you know, he did set sail from there, and this the monument there to Captain Cook at Whitby on the cliff. I was hoping to actually go up there, you know. I would have probably gone up there. I've been to Whitby before, videos before at Whitby. The one with the three churches, if you remember.
Yeah.
It said the three churches close. That was Whitby, but that was on the other side of it. You know, I need to go onto the other cliff to do the Captain Cook aspect of it. But you know, so it was all to do with the Royal Society. I mean, these people used to go exploring in the 1800s.
I mean, the Royal Society is a story that, I mean, how come no one's ever really, I mean, at least to my knowledge, really kind of looked at that angle from like a fake history and science perspective and brought the Royal Society in on it? I mean, all the flat earth videos I used to watch and shit like that, I don't remember anybody bringing that stuff up, you know?
Not really, no. But they were big on the exploration, starting really in the 1700s. I mean, really, I know before that, I mean, you go back to people like Queen Elizabeth I, who sent people out with the pirate ships. But that's going back even earlier. But you see, because something happened, some kind of catastrophe, which I think was 1500, 1600, something happened.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm thinking something could have happened even earlier, and the 1600 is when the recovery cruise. That's the way I kind of look at the Crown, as like they were just handed the job of cleaning up and repopulating. I mean, there's still further up to go than the Crown.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm just trying to pinpoint the time.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, to me, it's an impossible task. I mean, they've put so many roadblocks and things in the way, you know.
that's a good way to put it, because the timeline's been changed as well.
Yes.
It does make it even more difficult. But what I'm looking at is the people. And this is what I was interested in your last video, your latest one.
Mhm.
Because you were talking about the people could have been sort of hybrids. There were different types of people
Yes.
that we think of everyone as being like us, sort of in inverted commas. But the obvious, from what I've seen, I don't think they were. And I've mentioned this before, that I think that there was hybrid people, hybrid races. That, well, we're not told about that. It's all like we're all Homo sapien. It's actually called Homo sapien sapien.
Yes.
That
That's what they call us
supposed to
today, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but I think there were other races that were similar.
Well, this is what they use, and I, again, there was, I did an episode which I never aired because it was so incomplete to me, right? There's so much more to do with with the story that I had, and it was really about the history of archaeology and anthropology, and they really use these like academic tools to obfuscate, I can't even say the word, obfuscate the past, and so like when you have like Neanderthal man or Java man, or and they, whatever other species of Homo sapien there was out there beforehand, they want to use this. It was all interbreeding that made them go away. No. They were hunted to extinction. I mean, that's more the way I look at it. It's very convenient that you could say that we just bred them out.
Oh, right, yeah. It's almost like they were sort of experimental.
Yeah. Well, that's what's interesting about when you read, like, and I'm sure you've read like Zecharia Sitchin and the 12 Planet books and things like that, right?
Yeah.
That really
That's
interested
right.
me. The whole, like, was a scientist or who had a genetics lab, right? That idea is really interesting to me. I just don't think anymore that it was like outer space or anything like that.
Yeah, that's the thing with Sitchin's books, because he was saying that these races were coming from outer space, but now we know that they weren't, because there isn't any space. So once you know that, then that's what changes, that aspect. But I think that was the red herring, to make people think they're coming from outer space to put you off track.
Yeah.
But if you take that aspect out, that they weren't coming from outer space, but it was entities, people, whatever you want to call them, creatures, that they didn't look like us. I mean, the Anunnaki anyway didn't look like us.
Right.
They were here, or the other races were here, but they weren't the same as us, but they were here. And in fact, they hadn't come from outer space. They were here already. They were indigenous to here. They had to be.
Right.
So this is
Or
what
you're
people,
looking at interdimensional, like they're coming from another dimension or vibrational plane.
Yeah, that's another possibility. Yeah, that certain races could be coming from other dimensions, of course. But I think that going back to medieval times, what I've seen is the representations of various people that were described as pilgrims, for example. I've seen them in the churches, on the fonts and things like that, a medieval font, Anglo-Saxon font, and there were characters on there depicted.
Yeah.
And straight away, I mean, people don't bat an eyelid, they just walk past it, it's a font. Anybody visiting, they don't really look at anything in any great detail. And I don't suppose I would have done at one time, but now I look at it differently, and it picked my attention, because I thought, well, these characters here, they don't look like us.
No.
And yet they were supposed to be the people who were building the churches or whatever. Some are depicted as pilgrims. And I thought, well, what's this? It doesn't look anything like us. When I say us, I mean, I know the people look different,
Right.
anyway than today, but they didn't look anything like
Right.
the template to what
Everyone
we would
has everyone's proportions are similar enough, you know.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But they didn't look anything like that because they were that's what I discovered. You see, this is why I'm not really interested in the giant aspect of it. I'm not saying there weren't any giants.
Yeah.
But I think there's too much emphasis on this. And some of it's ridiculous, saying giants 2 miles high and all things like that. I mean,
Oh, you're not into the mountains as giants?
well, I'm not interested in because what I've seen, where I've been looking, is I've seen that the people were small.
Yeah. Well, there were definitely small people, you know. I mean, and they're hiding them. I mean, I remember, and maybe you remember as well, when like the Lord of the Rings movie was huge, right? They say they found like Hobbit-sized people in some cave somewhere, you know, the remains of them. Do you remember that? I wish I could look that up.
Yeah, well, I know I've read things about finding bodies of small people and things like that in different caves and whatever. You know, but yeah, so these races and different, what I call them hybrids, is because it's somehow developed into a different type from back then, or whenever that was, how many 100 years ago we're talking about. Because I think the time period is very short.
Yes, that's one thing I think, you know, I think our history is really, I mean, it's certainly not tens of thousands of years. I mean, it's a few hundred years is the way I look at it.
Yeah.
Or is the way I want to look at it, you know, I mean, something could change my mind, you know.
Yeah. Right. So what I was saying about these, you see what I've mentioned before about the serfs. I'm not sure whether you were the one that asked me about this, about the serfs, because obviously they were the worker race in the medieval times. They were called serfs. Now, I've always been fascinated by them, and I could tell anyway that they didn't look like us, and there were two disparate sets of people. But they obviously weren't the same, because otherwise, how could you have one group of people who are up there and they're, you know, they own everything and know the land and they're wearing all the fancy clothes? I mean, the clothes that they wore.
Well, that's Lorna, that's unbelievable that you mentioned that, because in the next like 2 episodes, it's all about the clothing I'm finding, right? And that it's no coincidence that like Queen Elizabeth is from the Drapers Union or whatever, the worshipful.
Oh yeah, that's right.
You know, and there was a draper who founded the YMCA. I mean, I'm still looking at Shaftesbury. There's a lot to go on with him yet, right? Did you know that the 10th Lord Shaftesbury was murdered?
No.
Yeah,
I don't listen about the Shaftesburys. I need to look into that so I can get speed on that one.
The Shaftesbury story is getting crazier and crazier, especially seeing like who he was married to. And I don't have these names off the top of my head. You know, he marries into a family of prime ministers. There are like 3 or 4 prime ministers around this family whose daughter he marries, you know. I mean, it just gets crazy with his connections to not only like and you mentioned mining, right?
Yeah.
He was essentially the patron politician of the miner. You know, he fought for miners' rights. He made sure that women and children couldn't work in mines. But he has ties through the education reform. It's
Can
crazy.
I just stop you there, Drew? When you mentioned the mines, I think I mentioned, was it this morning, about the title at Shaftesbury.
Yeah.
Well, the name itself, shaft, is a mine shaft.
Yeah.
And bury, it means store, of course. But shaft, and I thought,
wait a minute. So wait a minute. What did you just said? So you said shaft, right? We know what that means, and then bury, it means door. So really, it could be translated as trap door.
Well, I always thought bury meant store.
Oh, star. Okay, star.
Sure, yeah, sorry, yeah. That was good, he said trap door. that was totally random, but
But that would be amazing if his name meant trapdoor.
it's my accent, probably my teeth. Well,
Yeah, there's going to be some translation issues. It's okay.
yeah. So it is strange. I mean, some of these people did actually sort of have a conscience, and obviously he was one of them. But I mean, they were the landowners.
Well,
I mean,
I don't know if he had a conscience so much as it was his job to get, like, he was like a foreman, and that's the way I look at these people, like the kings and these dukes, and I mean, they're on a job. I mean, this is work for them, right? This is not,
oh, yeah.
at least back then. I don't know what the situation is now, but they were in charge of getting everything in order for when all the worker population was going to come in, which they were anticipating, whether they were creating it themselves or they knew it was coming through their genetic programs that they were working on or what have you. But they were getting everything ready with these exhibitions. They all come in at the same time. It's all this one big, like, sort of info dump in the mid 1800s.
Yeah. But going back to the nobles in the medieval times,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these nobles.
Well, they're the start of it, right?
The word noble, I mean, where did that come from? They're the nobles, and they're a different breed, really, from this other breed that were the serfs.
Mm-hmm.
And the twain shall meet. And obviously they didn't have anything to do with one another whatsoever.
Right.
Apart from just purely the role that the serfs played was just to do all the work. And the nobles didn't do any work, and they wore all these fancy clothes. And where the clothes came from, I have no idea. I was only mentioning this yesterday to my other half, my roadie. That's the calling my roadie.
Oh, yeah. He's your roadie. Don't you worry. You're a rock star, Lorna. Don't worry.
So I said, well, whoever was making these clothes, because the clothes were absolutely fantastic. They were embroidered, they were jeweled, they were so elaborate clothes they wore. Expensive clothes, everything you can think of. But who made them? Who made the clothes?
Well, this is when I was looking at Shaftesbury, and and all this was happening at the Industrial Revolution. One thing it says is that the textile industry was the pioneer of the Industrial Revolution, making clothes. That's how the Industrial Revolution started.
Well, of course it was, yeah, because in the mills and the weaving and all that and the wool, and that's why a lot of these places where I've been recently, the places I've been, for example, where I was last week, and I was surmising that I thought the sea came further inland at one time, which I'm sure it did. Because that landscape, you could tell that river had gone down to a trickle from what it was before. And I think the sea came inland anyway. This would mean that this is how these people came in, these merchants and nobles, they came in on the boats. Because obviously the land travel to get through to these areas, this area here, anyway, this part of England, was covered in dense forest until only 200 years ago.
Yeah.
They started some deforestation.
Yeah, where did all the trees go?
Well, they cut them down because they had to cut them because it was so dense forest. They wouldn't have been able to do anything. And obviously they used some of the wood for building things and different things like that. But they did cut.
But it's interesting too because all the things that survived, of course, are stone, or brick.
Yeah, that's right. But they came in, but to travel up the country, how would they travel other than by boat? Because there were hardly any roads.
Right.
I mean, there were just dirt tracks for horses and things like mules or whatever, beasts of burden, mules or whatever, or horses. But I mean, that's all they could travel by unless they came by boat. So the water had to come further inland to bring the boats in, to bring these people in to make the settlements. And then that's what I'm fascinated by these places. But they've got the massive churches, and that's something else that's strange.
Oh, God.
It's a place in the middle of nowhere, virtually. It's still only a small village now, but even back then, it's never been big.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had a massive church.
Yeah, like I
But
said, I like to refer them as machines, you know. Don't know exactly what they were doing, but I don't think they were built for houses of worship. They were co-opted for that.
well, yeah, worshipping what? That's another question.
That's another excellent point. You know, if they were designed for houses of worship, perhaps they weren't designed for the God that is worshipped there today.
No, definitely not. But I think that they were, places of gathering energy for sure. But when people talk about free energy, we have to pay for the electricity bills and things like that. It wasn't like that, because back in the past they didn't have the need for the electrical gadgets that we have now. They didn't exist.
No.
I mean, obviously that's obvious, because even going to my grandparents didn't have any of the electrical, never had a washing machine or a fridge or anything like that even then. So people going back hundreds of years ago, the energy, what was it used for? Well, it was used for telecommunication. It wasn't used for people having an electric bill, because they've got a washing machine and a television and things like that.
Right.
People get wrong what the energy was for. So they say, no, we now have to pay for our energy bill. It could have been free. But it wasn't that. They weren't using energy for that. They were using this energy that was taken from the ether. I believe it was obviously for telecommunication, and they could communicate from these different places that were placed on hilltops quite often, and they were used as beacons. But it was a beacon for telecommunication, telegraph message. That's how they could communicate throughout the country.
Right. I mean, well, things. You know, how did they communicate? You think about these like ancient wars. You know, there weren't runners on foot like they want you to believe, like the story of Marathon or whatever, right? Yeah. It's like, I mean, there was nobody running from Gaul to Rome, you know, in enough time that could report anything happening in like a real-time context.
No, so they'd be absolutely exhausted. It's not realistic. They did have, and I'm sure from what I've seen, that they had the communication to communicate via telegraph wires, or telegraph, not a wire even. It was a some form of through the ether. Well, really, like communication we have now, like we're communicating now over the Atlantic Ocean, but somehow there was a method. I think it was done through these church buildings.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Because they were invariably on hillsides, but it was a good lookout post, obviously.
And that they used, like, you know, especially with like the organs and things like this, if they were using sound, you know, music, harmony, vibrations, that could be their communication, right? I mean,
and other aspects that we've noticed with the stones, the stones, because I've noticed that they're placed in a certain way.
That observation you made about them perhaps controlling pitch, you know, being musical notes.
Yeah,
that blew my mind. I mean,
because everything comes down to musical notes, and
it's its own language, you know. I mean,
but it's something so complicated that we can't fathom it out so far. But there's something there. That there's also the tombs that are like the box tombs.
Mm-hmm.
They're placed on the top, and obviously people used to think, I suppose, that the coffin was inside this box tomb on top, above the soil, but obviously there wasn't anything there. And some of them, I think, were like what I've said before, a form of an electric bolt. It forms another purpose. It does perform some kind of purpose that what we don't know what it is.
It's been lost, right? Yeah.
It's all connected up. It's like a box. It's like a musical box in a way.
Yeah.
When you have a musical box, and there's a mechanism inside that plays a tune on a much more complicated scale. There's a reason why these boxes are like they are. And I think it does go down a very deep rabbit hole as to what the real purpose was.
I mean, they could have been used, I mean, you know, without getting like too fantastical, especially the sizes of them, they could have been used for teleportation. They could have been used to send how do people get from place to place so fast and deliver their news? You go in the box, You know, you get broken down and you get shipped across the ocean and you materialize in another church, you know, and they just dial you up.
Exactly. Something along those lines.
I mean, it sounds crazy, but why not, you know?
Well, yeah, it does sound crazy, but I think there is something along those lines, because there's something about the churches that we don't understand.
Oh,
and
so much.
I still don't believe that
Yeah.
they were. So many people have talked about going there for healing and playing the organ for healing people. I don't believe that for 1 minute.
No, I don't either. I'm not down with that one. Yeah.
The frequencies can heal people, of course, yeah, but that's not what those buildings were for. And the organ music, that only came in later. I mean, there were no organs in there in medieval times.
Not that we're aware of, right? You know.
They weren't. The organs were brought in, you know, in the churches, were started being made into the Christian churches.
Yeah.
In the late 1700s to
Right.
1800s.
And then they
put in these fancy organs, and a lot of them were made in Germany. There's some absolutely fantastic organs, pipe organs that were made in Germany and brought over here into the churches. You know, I don't know what really this purpose was, that they had to have these billions of organs.
Well, regardless of the purpose, what it does is it changes it corrupts the harmony or frequency of the original architecture, because that has its own frequency.
That's right, yeah.
You know, and so when you put these big pipe organs in, every time you play a note or song or whatever, you're changing the harmony, the frequency of the church building itself.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, Andrew. It goes very deep, and it's a very complicated question. But I think as you go down, you peel back more layers and start to notice more things, that there's something going on there. And the timeline where a lot of these places, they were there, but they weren't actual churches in 1700s. And I think this is when a lot of these people came in after the major catastrophe, what we could call the Black Death.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because sometimes when I look at the stories of the Black Death and all these plague stories that we have throughout our given history, the history that they give us, all right, to me that just seems like it's a planted tool to remind us how good we have it today, and how, you know, how thankful we should be for modern medicine and masks and tests and things like this, and low death rates. Because when oh my God, you know, 500 years ago, half the population died, you know. They kind of have these stories planted throughout our history to slowly, you know, numb us to the one that we're experiencing today, you know, or the small outbreaks that we have today.
That's right, yeah. But I don't buy it. There was obviously something occurred, and that accounts for the blackened buildings that was totally black.
Now these buildings. Now this is not soot or anything that's on these buildings. They're charred.
It's so jet black, and we're told it was caused by the Industrial Revolution. I remember being told as a child that the reason all these buildings are black is because of the soot that came from the factories,
all the smoke and stuff.
It wouldn't happen like that. Not when the buildings are not even anywhere near the factories. But yet they're still covered in black. You know, totally jet black, really.
Yeah.
It's obvious that something transpired, and there was blackness everywhere. But this is when, there again, I think something started springing up in the 1700s. With these people who came in wearing these fancy clothes. It was the Georgian people, the dandies. They were all dressed in silk jackets, and the men were wearing white stockings.
Oh, Lorna, you said silk. I love you.
It's not the other way around now. But even the women don't wear things like that now.
Yeah.
So, they were wearing the white powdered wigs. And these people came in from somewhere, and these were the ones who became the the founders of the city. And it's as if they were masterminding the establishment of the built-up cities, because up till the 1700s, everybody lived in the rural areas.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I suppose I'm talking about England here. I mean, because obviously America was different
Yeah.
from a different angle to what we were, because there weren't supposed to be really anybody there in
Right.
America. There were people.
Plenty of people, allegedly. You know, I have to say that for almost everything because I don't know what to trust. You know, and yeah, but there is the story that they tell us. Yeah, there was plenty of people here. I've been looking at some research from a few other channels, like Tom. You know, Tom Carberry.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
channels like him, and there's a new guy out there. His name is UB. I'll send you a link to him, where
Yeah.
he's doing research about how America is actually Egypt in the Middle East, and that the
Yeah,
Nile is actually the Mississippi River in these old, you know, biblical writings. You know,
Which one's the Mississippi?
say again.
Which one?
The
Which one
Mississippi,
is?
yeah, the Mississippi.
Which one's the Mississippi?
Oh, that's the big one that divides America, like right in the middle. It goes north to south, right from Louisiana all the way up to Minnesota.
What did it used to be called, though?
Before the Mississippi, as far as
Yeah.
I know, it was always that was the Indian name, as far as I know, but I'm not 100% on that.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I've looked at Tom's work, and I do think it's quite brilliant, actually, and
Oh,
I do
yeah.
go on with a lot of what he says about this the medieval times, the biblical times.
Yes.
So, but when I look around, and all I can see is I can't see a lot of. It's as if there was a gap from the Tudor times.
Yeah.
And then there was people who were wearing these elaborate clothes in Tudor times. And then
And
there
now
seemed to be
the just
in a word.
just to refresh my memory here a little bit, the Tudor times, we're talking 1500s.
Yes.
Yeah. Hmm.
And then into Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth I,
Yeah.
Francis Drake, and people like that.
Yep. Sir Walter Raleigh.
Walter Raleigh, and then that goes into people who I know were in my city, who were, Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned here in this city,
Oh, wow.
Sheffield, for 14 years. She was imprisoned, and so the people who imprisoned her, well, it came under the Duke of Norfolk, who were the Howards, which of course
Really?
you mentioned
The
about
Howards, yeah.
with, you know, in Baltimore, the connection there.
Oh my God.
There does seem to be a lot of connection, and so
it gets crazier and crazier every time I look.
yeah, it does. It's quite strange, the connection with Baltimore, and but so these Tudor people, but then it seems as if there seems to be a bit of a gap, and I think that's when something happened. There was an earthquake here in this area in 1575, which I've only recently found out about, strangely. And they were worried that Mary Queen of Scots might escape from the castle because it rumbled the castle walls, and I think some of the walls fell down. And you know, I mean, obviously there's no real earthquakes that anybody mentions in this country now these days.
Yeah.
There have been minor ones, but you know, nothing that you hear about where there's all big boulders falling or anything like that, like I've seen evidence of on my travels.
Yeah.
But one where they were worried about this earthquake in 1575, you know, that happened, and I think there were some other different things that happened, and then but something occurred. I think a lot of people died and disappeared, and the population went down. And then, see, the strange thing is, then we get in the 1700s with the agricultural revolution, and so that the people were more proliferating a lot more then. And then we get the agricultural revolution in the 1700s, and these people who were dressed in the fine clothes, and they were orchestrating the changes in the different regions. And,
oh yeah, well that's one of the things, like, you know, they present to me, it seems like they present our history as something that happened like sort of like a very linear progression. Whereas I tend to look at it more as you're saying that they're setting up the agricultural revolution, because they're planning, they know what they need to do for the population that's coming. Like they're anticipating, they're building something in anticipation of, and not something that's like a linear progression.
Well, yeah, it seems that to be the case. So, like you say, yeah, we're presented in a linear, but you see, we don't know what time is. It's not linear, and so
Well, that's
therefore,
like in the episode I did with Mary about Shaftesbury being born in October, and it always once I found out about the calendar change like 2 years ago or whatever it was, because I hadn't really paid attention to the Julian and the calendar and that kind of thing before this, right? Why did it never strike me that October, Oct means 8, but it's the 10th month? How did that never strike a chord? Nobody really thinks about that. Why is October called 8, but it's the 10th month? Because it was originally the 8th month, right?
Yeah, March used to be it was the new year.
Yeah.
It was the new year was March the 3rd.
And that's why I think it's very crazy that, at least in America, I think England was a little bit behind us in terms of like lockdown and things like that. But, we got locked down on the Ides of March.
Well, that's true. That is true, yeah. It is strange. Yeah, strange how it happened. We had a heavy rainfall for about 6 months.
Yeah.
Heavy rainfall here. And then suddenly when the lockdown came, and then the weather turned beautiful and we had lovely weather. And that was quite remarkable, actually. Because the English weather, of course, is always quite changeable.
Yeah.
What the saying is that you can get all the seasons in one day in England.
Yeah. Well, what they say here, I'm sure we stole this, but in Baltimore, they say if you don't like the weather, wait a day.
That's right. But yeah, so we're digressing a bit. But you see these, once again, it's the people in the finery. Yeah. And they really were dressed so fine.
Oh,
and then the people at the bottom were dressed virtually in rags. Literally.
Every time I see pictures, and I have one I'm going to bring up, every time I see a picture of a king or a nobleman, and it's all this, really fancy getup, I'm like, how is that practical in any way, shape, or form? What does this guy do when he needs to take a dump? He's got to take everything off. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the clothing, though, was quite remarkable, really, when you think. But then at the other end of the spectrum, they were just wearing literally rags.
Yeah.
And but then they got fine, and they were wearing the white powdered wigs and everything like that. But they were the people who were from in the 1700s, because there's a church that I covered in one of my videos early on, that it's now been demolished. But the old pictures of it, well, it was still standing until 1938. It was demolished. Strangely enough, the year before World War II broke out. But when you look at it, it looks nothing like a church, because it just looked like a temple, and it had got the Roman statues on the top. But the people who were around when that church, well, they call it a church, but I think it was originally a temple, not a church.
Mm-hmm.
The people who were around at that time were the Regency people, and they're wearing the silk coats and the white stockings for the men. And they when they opened this church, apparently it was opened. Well, they said it was built in 1720. Well, I don't believe it was. I think it was already there.
Yeah.
And they said it stood empty for 20 years because they couldn't decide who was going to be the minister, who would choose the minister. That was it. Because the people who supposedly funded it, they had like a committee, as they do, and they were squabbling amongst themselves. Now they built this church who was going to decide who would be the minister, and they took 20 years to squabble over this, and it was left standing empty. But that didn't ring true for me, because I think the building was already there. But why was it stood empty for 20 years? And then they ended up putting in a fantastic organ And what I read about this organ, it was one of the super duper organ. It was made in Germany, and they manufactured this organ and brought it over here from Germany, put it in this church. But the people, while they were squabbling over this organ and the church, the church and everything, the minister, the people who were in the ordinary people in the street. Then it was before photography actually, or what we're told photography was invented. I don't agree with that either. I think a lot of these paintings you see of these old masters, and they look like a photograph, really.
Oh yeah.
So I think form a photograph. So we haven't got photographs of these early times in the 1700s. Only the drawings or the paintings and drawings that people made. But it shows just like a woman sitting outside in the street with a basket, and they used to be selling lavender or something like that in the street, and you just see a picture of a woman with a baby in her arms sitting outside in the street, and just one or two people walking past, and that's the depictions that we've got.
Yeah.
And when they were squabbling over the minister for this church, but there were the people in the fine clothes. Now, what was going on? This was after the Tudor times, after the Tudors had disappeared. That they'd gone, and I think there was something happened.
So after the Tudors, it was the Stuarts?
But it's when you look at the clothing, it was this time of the Tudors, and I'm just looking at the area that I'm looking at, in my neck of the woods, really.
Right. Yeah.
The people who frequented, the characters that we know about that frequented the areas, and it was the earls that were Tudors, and they were wearing these fancy clothes, and then there seemed to be a bit of a gap somehow.
Now,
Regency people.
Now, was it the Tudors who started this, like earldom and dukedom and things like that, or was that happening before them?
That was before. It was in Norman times.
Norman times they started that.
Yeah, because King William King William I, he was called William the Great actually in his own lifetime. He was called William the Great, William the Conqueror.
Yeah.
But he was a Duke of Normandy, so he was a Duke of Normandy.
Right.
But he then came over here and became King William. But he actually didn't spend much time here. He spent most of his time in France, which of course wasn't called France then, it was called Gaul. Well, it was actually Normandy. It was the kingdoms of Normandy. They had like the royal different rulers. The dukes, you see, he was the Duke of Normandy.
Yeah.
And so they had different regions.
Yeah, I've looked into some of that. I haven't reached that far back yet. I've come across it briefly, but I haven't had the opportunity to look at it too deeply.
It's such a wide spectrum.
Yeah.
I mean, I've only seen this because of, visiting the churches. And, a lot of them, these churches said that were built in Norman times. A lot of these places, I think, I know for a fact that some of them, the very old ones, were actually originally monasteries. They were monasteries.
See, I got so sidetracked because I remember we had an exchange. I want to say it was around Christmas time already. That I thought that my next video was going to be all about the monks, but the story the story took me away from it. Because the story of the monks, is something that I'm going to be hitting on very, very soon, because pretty much everything that we understand about our history today comes from monk translators. That's
right. Oh yeah, it does. Yeah, these people like Bede and these other people like Geoffrey and Monmouth and people like this, really obscure people.
Yeah.
And these fantastic manuscripts that they wrote,
oh my
all
God,
in Latin, and it was all embossed with gold and all the colours and everything, and the writing they did. I mean, they spent all their life.
Oh yeah.
Just doing manuscripts. I mean, that's another story altogether, really.
Oh well, it's a story I'm going to tell soon enough.
That's right, because I was starting to get into the monks, and I think I was diverted to other things. it's this because there's so many different strands to all this. But I mean, then when you look at the monks that go back, well, they were there before the Normans. Obviously, they were already there, but they continued into the Tudor time because it was Henry VIII who decided that the monks were so powerful that he decided to get rid of them, and he destroyed them and ransacked the monasteries. You see, because he must have realised they were more powerful than the king.
Yeah.
So obviously that's why he decided that he called it the dissolution of the monasteries. And so we've got all these abbeys, including Glastonbury Abbey and others all over the country that were destroyed by Henry VIII. I mean, they were so wealthy, so powerful, and he wasn't going to tell them what to do. So that's when he decided they were destroyed and virtually bulldozed. But it makes you wonder what was going on in those monasteries. But they were there before, obviously before the Normans came.
Yeah.
The monasteries were there with the monks in there, and you know what were these monks doing?
Right, already in place by the Norman invasion.
They were already there, the monks.
Yeah.
And but the monks were so all powerful, wealthy. But then again, that brings us into the Templars, because the Templars were warrior monks, and it was an order of monks.
Yeah.
Warrior monks.
Well, I think it's interesting that, I mean, the ties that can be made to, thinking about this, and now it's been a long, long time since I read anything real about the Knights Templar or anything like that, and you can't trust much of what you see in movies and things like that. But it is interesting to me the close connections that can be made between England and the crusading kings of Jerusalem. I mean, there's no coincidence in that, and there's no coincidence that in the mid 1800s is when they started doing the whole Zionism thing, also out of England, and that there were once British kings on the throne of Jerusalem. I mean, there's no coincidence there, I don't think.
That's right. It all ties up together.
Yeah.
And then it brings in. I always used to think what a difficult journey it would be, or a difficult voyage, to traverse the seas, in those times. But then when you look at it now on the flat Earth map, and it looks a different story altogether. And then these places will be much more easy to get to, because people from the biblical days, for example, like Joseph of Arimathea, he definitely did come here trading tin. But if he'd have come over from Jerusalem, it would have been, that was, in the Holy Land, in Palestine, and that would have been a very difficult journey to come over exporting tin and trading with tin. But he came over and he lived in Glastonbury. In fact, I think he's supposed to be buried in Glastonbury. I have actually been to Glastonbury.
I would love to get to Glastonbury.
Yeah, we went about 5 years ago or something like that. But that was before I knew anything about what I know now, before I knew about the flat Earth,
Yeah.
When you know about all that, it changes everything from the perspective that you look at things. So, I think we did see Dave of, supposedly, Joseph of Arimathea, but he was exporting tin, and of course he was coming to Cornwall. He would be able to come if it was on the flat Earth map. But not only that, as Tom Carberry speculates, that Jerusalem was really Barcelona.
Yeah.
And that brings us into the Spanish aspect of it.
Right, Iberia.
Yeah, that's it. It ties it all in with Iberia, and
now that's, one of the things that really got me going was in one of the videos I did called Walking Delusional. I came across, it was Inanna, the goddess Inanna, this Iberian princess who represents the consort of Baal. I found her on the side of a building, and that's one of the things we were kind of talking about a little bit earlier when you were mentioning how the people, like the serfs that were portrayed on the reliefs that you were finding in churches, didn't look like us, right?
Yeah.
I find
lunchbacks.
Yeah, I'm finding so many, like in Baltimore, I'm finding so many reliefs that were allegedly made in the late 1800s, early 1900s, of very strange looking creatures all over the place. It's like, what are you telling us with this? You know, why did you need to make this weird worm guy on here? You know, I don't.
Yeah, as if it's some kind of fantasy character.
You're right, but
When in fact they did exist. But they were real people.
yeah,
But they were like, well, I mean, it cannot go down all kinds of different tangents with this. They were almost like little dwarves. They were almost like the way I've seen them. They didn't even seem to stand up straight. They looked very bent over.
yeah.
They're almost like hunchbacks. The portraits of them. That's how they look. And the faces were quite grotesque in a way, really.
Yeah.
You couldn't say any of them were beautiful, put it that way.
No.
They didn't, they seem to have quite grotesque features, really. I think that also comes in with the mining, because when you bring it in with the fairy stories, which I think there's lots of truth in those as well, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I mean,
yeah,
they lived under a mountain and they were going down to the mine. They were almost like these serfs. So that would fit in with that, wouldn't it? That the serfs would also be going down these mines, mining for whatever they were required to mine for, which was one of the things would be lead as well as tin in certain areas.
Yeah,
was tin, and in this area there was lead, lots of lead mining. Now that's something else that I thought of when they talk about all these people died of the plague, and it was in a lead mining area, and I think a lot of them died of lead poisoning.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, yeah, there certainly were no respirators or anything like that back in the day.
So, and the people, they were just, all they did, they just were nothing more than just there to work and just work and die, basically. Just work till you drop, work, that's what their role was. And there were the people who were the nobles or the merchants, whatever they were, these people coming in right from the beginning of the Norman era, and going right through to the 1800s. The worker class were just there to be almost just nothing more than just to do the work, whatever it happened to be at the time. And it went from mining for lead and tin, or then it went right through to the agricultural revolution, into the way that was all mapped out. The people who had small holdings, they just would have like little people who lived in rural areas, which everybody did back then. And they had a piece of land and they couldn't really live off the land, just have a little piece of land and have some animals and grow some vegetables and whatever. But then what happened? They brought in the Enclosures Act, and that meant that the landowners requisitioned all the land, and they took their piece of land off them, and this caused a lot of hardship and starvation to these people. So from these people having their own piece of land, it was taken off them. It was a bit like in Bolshevik Russia.
Yeah.
That happened there as well after the revolution. And there, lots of the millions of peasants died of starvation because of that. They had the land taken away. They were all farmers or small holdings. And the same thing happened in the agricultural revolution in the 1700s. So these people then became slaves to the land, but they weren't just working the land for themselves anymore to earn their own living. They were working for someone else.
Yeah.
And this culminated in the workers rising up. The agricultural workers started to rise up against the conditions that they had and the poor pay. They probably just lived in a little cottage, that was on the land that would be owned by the landowners, the squires of the land, and they started to rise up, and there was a group called the Puddle Martyrs,
The top of
and
the
that
mountain?
was the Puddle Martyrs.
Okay.
Puddle Martyrs. It was in a village called Puddle, and it's in Dorset. And I actually went down there on holiday, somewhere else I did go to visit, and we went to Puddle, and there's a museum there. But these people, it was a group of the agricultural workers that rose up against the conditions and poor pay. And what happened was, basically, they were stopped and they were sent to 7 years hard labour in the colonies. That was the punishment. And they were shipped to Australia. 7 years hard labour.
Wow.
That was, they were rising up against the conditions on the land. And basically the ringleaders were sent, they were sent to Botany Bay to Australia. That's the question, what was going on down there, because obviously when Captain Cook arrived, they found buildings were already there.
Mm-hmm.
So, what were these convicts being sent down there for the hard labour? What were they doing, really?
Yeah, they were digging out buildings. This is what they were doing.
So, but luckily for these guys, they had a friend in Parliament who took up their case and managed to get them a pardon after 4 years. He got them a pardon after 4 years, and then it took a year for the news to reach them. So it showed what it was like to try and get the news through to Australia from here, that they'd been pardoned, and then they were brought back. But they weren't allowed to stay here. They were sent to Canada. Sent to Canada. The whole family were sent to Canada, except for one of them, because the others were all related, except for one who wasn't related, and he stayed in the area, but he ended up going to work in a factory, because by then it was becoming, the factories were coming in. And this person, I actually visited the grave of this one person who stayed behind. The others, I think they were given the money to get them out of the way, because they didn't want them coming back and upsetting the apple cart with the other agricultural workers. So they were parcelled off to Canada. They gave them the money to set up a new little settlement in Canada, and they even built their own church. And their descendants still live there to this day. However, this one that survived, this one that stayed in Dorset, in the area, he wasn't related to the others. And he ended up, he lived to be 85, and he died in a workhouse. And
Still working at 85.
He lived to be 85 after all that he'd gone through.
Yeah.
Going to Botany Bay and hard labour, coming back, and the arduous journey there and back. I mean, many people died on the ship.
Yeah.
Because it was such an arduous voyage to go.
He came from good stock.
Must have, yeah. And anyway, he lived to be 85, and we visited the grave in the churchyard at Puddle. And strangely enough, I said, I'll have a photo taken here at the grave of this Puddle martyr. And the photo never came out, which I think is strange, because I just felt it was odd that all the other photos I took on that holiday, and that one didn't come out. And it was standing at the side of his grave. But he died in the workhouse. That tells you something, because, there again, he lived a long time. He died in the 1800s by then. It was going into the 1800s by then. But I don't know. I think it was something, the reason why the photo didn't come out, I think it was something to do with the frequency.
Yeah.
There was a frequency interfering with that photo being taken. That's his grave, if you get a man's grave.
Interesting. Lorna, I'm gonna take a quick 2-minute timeout. I'm gonna go refresh my coffee.
Right.
And I will be right back.